Now here are a few thoughts from William Peter Blatty, the author and creator of The Exorcist.
When I was a sophomore at Georgetown University back in the Bronze Age, I think it was, 1949, I'd read a story in the Washington Post about a young man living in the area who supposedly had been possessed and exorcised of a demon. There are also a lot of stories on the campus about it. Apparently, the exorcist or exorcists were boarded for a period of days on the university campus, and people will talk, and little details would filter into our lectures in class. And I determined at that time, I was so fascinated by it, and I thought, if this could be researched and validated, authenticated, what a tremendous piece of corroboration it would be for all we're being taught here at the oldest Catholic university in America. It would certainly be powerful evidence for the existence of spirit, whether it be good or evil, and therefore, by extension, touching my own hopes and the hopes of all men, that the grave has no victory and death really has no sting, and that we go on forever. That was the inspiration. It was many and many a year later before I got around to actually writing this book. It was not intended to be a novel. It was to be a nonfiction account of that particular case. But I needed the exorcist in the case. I'd done a tremendous amount of research at the Library of Congress, read everything published on the subject, and unfortunately, with the exception of one dubious case reported in Erling, Iowa in 1928, I think it was, 28 or 29, everything was from such a distant past, at least a century, that the accounts tended to be a bit suspicious. I mean, well, where's the corroboration? Who were the witnesses? Who could I talk to? Who could I interview? And they didn't. And so my faith in the phenomenon, I mean, it didn't disappear, but it was hardly vibrant. So I set out to find the exorcist in the case I had heard about when I was at Georgetown. And I did. His name was Father William F. Bowdern, a Jesuit, who at that time was posted at St. Louis University. And he was eager to cooperate with me, but he went to his archbishop, or then the cardinal, who had given a vow of absolute and total secrecy and confidentiality to the family of the young boy, the victim in that case. And he wrote back to me that they couldn't get it, that he could tell me nothing, but he could tell me one thing. At the end of his letter, he said, I can tell you one thing, the case I was involved with was the real thing. I had no doubt about it then. I have no doubt about it now. And such an honesty and normalcy and goodness seemed to radiate from this man's letters up to that time. I felt from just that one sentence a total assurance that the case he had dealt with was genuine. And that gave me the energy and the impetus to go forward and to write it with total belief in the phenomenon I was writing about, although at his insistence, not his insistence, he couldn't insist on anything, but he begged me not to write anything that would link the actual victim to my book. Anyone who thinks for 2 seconds with the problem of evil, we're not talking about moral evil, we're talking about the physical evil built into the fabric of the material earthquakes, cancer, mudslides that swallow children, the tiny ecumenidae underneath the pretty lilacs in the lawns, devouring the bacteria, creatures, dog eat dog, the big fish swallowing the little fish. I mean, it's obscene, and it's very, very painful. And it has been the greatest stumbling block to belief in God among those who have not been able to come to that belief as deeply as they may have yearned to do so. And, I've had my roller coaster ride in my youth on belief in God, and it was the problem of evil that was the cause of it. But on the other hand, what about the mystery of goodness? I mean, how do we explain that? How do we explain altruism? How do we explain a soldier throwing himself on top of a live grenade to save the other men in his squad? And we can go on and on and on. Loyalty, kindness, self-sacrifice. If it's true that there is no God and the material the universe is an accident, our appearance here is an accident, we are simply the products of evolution and survival of the fittest. Well, how do we explain all those other qualities? We ought, if that were true, then everyone in this world should be rushing forward blindly, ceaselessly, to accomplish their own selfish ends. But that's not the way things are. And that, to me, is an even greater mystery, this mystery of goodness, than the mystery of evil in the world where there is God. The night my mother died, August 23rd, 1967, I was living in the guest house, a tiny little cottage. The landlord, the owner, was a Hungarian named Peter Gorion. And it was about 10 o'clock at night. And I got into writing a screenplay called The Exorcist. It started with Karras in a confessional telling a priest he had lost his faith. It was, I'd written 2 pages when the phone rang. I received the news of my mother's passing. But at that point, I hadn't thought of writing the novel then. I would write the film. And I don't know what, it was after the death of my mother, everything changed. And I gave up the film and decided to go to the novel. Oh, I know what changed. Very simple reason. For a man collecting unemployment, I was invited to a New Year's Eve party by a wonderful writer, Burton Wohl. I never went out on New Year's Eve, but I went to Burton's house because I liked him so much. And there were just about, 8 or 10 people there, and one of them was the editor-in-chief of Bantam Books, who seemed to have met me in the past. He recognized me. We'd obviously talked some, but I'd forgotten him. He said, "Well, Bill, what are you doing?" No, not too much. Working on any projects? Well, I've got an idea for a book which is a little out of my line. He said, "What is it?" And I told him in a minute, a little thumbnail, because that's all I knew. All that I knew would only take a minute to tell. And he said instantly, without blinking an eye, "Oh, I'll publish that." And he offered me a small advance. I think the first payment of which was, $4,200, whatever. That was a fortune to me. Yes, that was the immediate impetus for forgetting the script and turning it into and writing the novel. No, the impetus for my writing the novel, when I wrote it, was very simply that comedies had gone out of style as films in Hollywood. And I simply could not get a job. I couldn't get arrested for a serious work. There was a Blatty, comedy. I mean, that's black, off-the-wall farce. Zany. What are you talking about? And I kept butting my head against that wall. And I thought, well, since A, I have nothing else to do right now except go down and collect my unemployment check once a week, this is the perfect time for me to write that novel I've been talking about, thinking about for so long. I had absolutely zero confidence that I could do it, that I could write something straight without. Perhaps that was the genesis of Lieutenant Kinderman's personality, because he gave me an outlet for some wit, some humor, some relief in there, something I was so accustomed to doing. The rest of it was hard. I was accustomed to spending no longer than 3 months on a comic novel, a screenplay, a month, 3 weeks, whatever. And this was torture, 18 hours every day for 9, 10 months a year. Of course, writing something straight, suddenly my fingers froze over the typewriter. Oh, this isn't funny. This is serious. Oh, this is literary. Oh, my God. I froze. I just froze. And it took me, seemingly, compared to my usual rate of production, absolutely forever. And I was so relieved to complete it. My hopes for it were simply that A, it would be respectable, and B, would demonstrate that I could write something other than farce. I know when I began to write the book, all I knew about it was that there would be a child who was possessed, and there would be an investigation by a Jesuit psychiatrist. And there would be an exorcism. That's all I knew. And I went from chapter to chapter to chapter, not knowing what was going to come next. I would come to the end of one. That's very nice. Then I would build 2 on the events of 1. Make sure there was no conflict. I'd come to the end of 2. Now I was stuck with all the material and the facts I laid out in 1 and 2, and then I would go on to 3, making sure everything was consistent with, and on, praying to God. I didn't know what the ending was going to be. I just prayed to God that I would not have painted myself into a corner and have, a Hungarian first act. You know what that is. Oh, well, the Hungarian first act, you have, the most incredibly enticing and intriguing kind of a beginning. But then there's no third act. In fact, the first producer in film I ever worked for told me, you know what started the Hungarian Revolution? CIA sent skywriters up over Budapest writing, "We have third acts." Well, my terror was I would come to that point and say, I don't have an ending. Well, by the time I got to the exorcism, and I was going along pretty well with it, I gave it to the man who gave me my first job in film, Bill Bloom. I trusted his story sense. I said, well, here's what I've got so far. And he read it in a single sitting in a chair in my living room. And then, drenched in sweat, he told me what he thought of it. And I said, well, let me tell you what comes next. He said, what do you mean next? I said, the exorcism's going to go on for another 120, 150 pages. I said, Merrin dies. He had read up to there. But now Karras is going to take over, and I'm going to have some really fascinating conversations between Karras and Merrin, and the demon, who will by that time claim to have been an intimate of Christ in Palestine, tormenting poor Karras. And he said, you can't do that. You can't do that to your reader. You can't put us through any more. Stop. Oh, I discarded his advice, but, at the end of 10 months, a gleam came into my eye. Maybe I can be finished next month. And in a couple of days, Yep, I made up my mind. I was going to heave Karras out the window. I was going to kill him. What a relief. Most people, readers of the book, but in particular viewers of the film, I think automatically conclude, oh, this is Satan who is doing it. It's the Prince of Darkness. Well, if you look at the many, many references to exorcism in the New Testament, both by Christ and by his disciples, you find that's not the way it's treated. It's always an unclean spirit or an evil spirit. That's as far as it gets. And, you know, my own presumption is that, you know, after death, there are forms of existence that await us, and there are the unredeemed, and there are tormented, restless spirits. And what a ghost story is all made of. They're restless, discontented, unhappy spirits, and who have perhaps not accepted their own mortal end. And the notion that when a mind has been shattered by, say, a mental illness or by an excessive use of powerful narcotics and drugs, it is very plausible to me that a restless spirit in this world that exists just side by side with ours, but at a different frequency, so easy to think that they can slip in to a shattered personality and take it over. And, you know, it's not simply the testimony of the Christian Gospels, but, you know, accounts of possession go back to ancient Egyptian times. I mean, there are written records of it. When you find a phenomenon that is so universally reported in all parts of the world, in all times of recorded history, you have to give a little bit of credence to the possibility that something is really going on there. The demon's target is not Reagan. It is the people around her. It just put me in mind of when I was writing it, and I was about 2/3 of the way through, and a young girl named Beverly Gray, who lived in the Valley, was a typist. I got her name out of the classified ads. And I was used to working, you know, through the night. But I was surprised when I got a call from her at about 2 in the morning. I hope it's not too late. No, it's all right. I'm up. She was working, typing. And I said, "What's something wrong? Don't you understand something in my manuscript?" She said, No. She said, "It just dawned on me. They're after him." Excuse me? They're after him. They're going to get him. Who do you mean? Karras. They're after him. Who is they, Beverly? You know, they. Them. Well, she was, of course, absolutely right. Karras, among the observers in that house, was the principal target. And this was the crucible of his faith. And the final moments of The Exorcist are his triumph in his conflict. It's made to believe that we're made to believe that this is round 2 between Father Merrin and the demon, whoever that demon is. Yeah, in a way, but that's the sidelight. It's the soul of Damien Karras that's involved here. And of course, it's true, everyone else in the house, because as Merrin explains, well, to Karras, what is the purpose of the invasion of this little girl? What's the point, even if it's true? Why? And Merrin explains the target is not the little girl. The target is us. Every person in this house. If it were on the screen, you'd see him looking directly at Karras, meaning you, Damien, in particular. And the point is to make us reject our own humanity, to lead us to believe that we are ultimately vile and bestial, repellent, unworthy animals, and even if there were a God, he could not possibly love us. And that, in the novel, it's laid in very clearly that Damien Karras has rejected his own humanity. I mean, just it's hard to think of us as being images of God and angelic beings in the face of the human gastrointestinal system, to give just one illustration of Damien Karras's hang-up. Karras has a conflict of faith, deep conflict of faith. He thinks that he has lost his faith, as a matter of fact. On the other hand, Father Merrin, who appears to be so serene and confidently rooted in his deep, deep faith, has problems, though. It's not apparent. There's no time to do this in the film, but in the novel, Father Merrin, whom I modeled in part on Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the great Jesuit paleontologist and philosopher, I read his diaries, all his letters, and in there you will find him berating himself for one particular fault among others, and that is his inability to want to affectionately embrace all of his fellow man. There are people he just doesn't like, doesn't want to be with, doesn't want to talk to, and has a dismal regard for as people. And he would, mea culpa, strike his breast again and again in his correspondence, praying, asking Christ to relieve him of this terrible vice, he thought it was, and weakness in him. No one who read, well, I can't say no one, but I never received any feedback in my mail from readers who didn't understand that Karras had won, had overcome the demon at the end. And this was as I cherish the great science fiction writer, Ray Bradbury. God, Alzheimer's has come, who called it a wonderful love story. He wished that he had written it, and it was a love story. And that did not elude readers of the novel, but it did elude those who saw the film. And this is not my fault, this is not Bill Friedkin's fault, because we spent endless sessions going over and over the choreography of that end scene, so that would be clear to even the meanest intelligence that Karras, to keep the demon from him, from strangling the girl, with a final, almost superhuman act of will, breaks free of the control of the demon and hurls himself out the window, because he knows in another 2 or 3 seconds the demon will be in control again and kill the girl. So what's the only way to save the girl's life? Throw himself out the window. He didn't want to kill himself. He wished to God there would be a net down there to catch him, but that was it. But in spite of that, nobody got it. And again, I believe it's because the audience is so benumbed by the emotional events. At that moment, they're not really taking it in. They're not really seeing and hearing what is actually happening in that scene. And they come away with this strange impression that the demon has taken Karras out the window. Although, God bless Frank Wells, who now passed away, God rest his soul, lovely man, who was then president of Warner Brothers, and The first month of the film's release, I was having dinner with him at his home. And then having a drink before dinner, alone with Frank, I complained to him as if I had anything to complain about. I said, those idiots who think that the demon wins, it takes Karras out the window. And he looked at me for a long moment, and then, God bless his honesty, he said, gee, Bill, that's what I thought happened. Lieutenant Kinderman, long before I started writing the novel, I remember having a line of dialogue flash through my head, or a thought, and I wrote it down on a tiny scrap of paper, which I was able to locate when I began writing the novel. And what it said was, in quotes, mental clearance sale. That's all I knew about him then. From that I built the whole character of a very extremely folksy, gemütlich, sort of a Yiddish uncle with a mind that was razor sharp and with the physiognomy and physical appearance of a puppy dog. That all came out of that one little scrap of paper, and I was crazy about him because I heard the rhythms of his speech in my head. My heritage is Lebanese, but there has to be some Hebrew or Jewish in the background, because those rhythms came so easily to me. And I loved writing dialogue for Kinderman. I felt he was adorable, and he was funny, and he was eccentric, and he was daring, and an altogether kind man. And he gave me a great outlet for that need to do what I do best, which is to write humorous, affectionately humorous dialogue. And I wish there had been more, in the film, actually. There's a ton of it in the novel. It was the Saturday Review expected fully that there would be a book a year by me with Kinderman as the hero. Yeah, it did tempt me. I couldn't think, I did Legion, in which he is the leading character. And then it sort of spent me. There he was. I've said every wonderful thing I have to say about Kinderman between these two books. I don't know what more. Well, it was just a matter of thinking up a really good murder mystery, I guess, and setting him on to that. There is no question in my mind that there is a link between Columbo and Kinderman. I want to make it very clear, Kinderman came first. I remember getting a letter from someone who had heard of my complaint. And he said, how can you say that? Your book appeared on the stand, or your movie appeared on such and such a date, and Columbo was on the air on such and such a date. And I wrote to him patiently explaining, first you get the idea for the book, and then you write the book, and it takes you about a year. Then it takes about 8 months after that for the book to be published and to hit the stands. And then the movie comes out. I said, the early stages of that chronology, suddenly Columbo appears. And I know that at the time I was negotiating the contract, the film contract for The Exorcist. A great sticking point was my demand that I have the right to do a Lieutenant Kinderman television series by X date. It was a very short fuse. And I made it a deal breaker. Now I go into from fact to speculation. Some agent, this manuscript was all over town, scratched his head on the other side because the negotiation was being done on behalf of a producer, not Warner Brothers. This was an option agreement for Paul Monet by the Ziegler, then Ross agency. Someone must have thought, What does he know that we don't know about Lieutenant Kinderman? He is desperate to do a TV series based on that. And from that thought, I'm further speculating the translation was made. Columbo was already, a Broadway show, but I don't think the character in Broadway had the floppy raincoat and the pretended Alzheimer's, all the rest of Kinderman's shtick. Peter Falk had a drink with me one night. He said, "No, that's not true. That's whatever." I think it's absolutely true. Of course, Shirley MacLaine was the model as a personality for the mother in The Exorcist. And when I finished it, I hadn't seen her in a little while, and I just got so blasted. I had many, many adult beverages after writing the end. And in that state, I picked up the manuscript and drove up into Encino and knocked on the door unannounced, and Shirley was home. In fact, she answered the door, and I this drunk thrust this manuscript into her chest and said, "Shirley, read this. It's going to make you a big star all over again." Idiocy. She invited me in, and we chatted. She gave me some strong black coffee. And she kept the manuscript, but she didn't get around to reading it for about 3 weeks. And then she was just insane about it. Wanted to cancel a film she was scheduled to do with Rex Harrison and do this instead. And then her agent, who used to be my agent, contacted me about the deal, and he knew, this agent, that I was starving. And he made such a lowball, insulting offer. And on top of that, I wanted to be connected. I wanted to protect this material. I wanted to produce it, associate producer. They didn't want me, not Shirley, but whoever the producing entity was, they didn't want me anywhere near. And I regretfully said no. And I wish Shirley had, I thought she was perfect, absolutely perfect for the part. Before the novel came out, but while, at the time when it had, Harper and Row were preparing to bring it out, it was going to be published. My agent had prepared Xerox copies of the manuscript and sent them to every single studio production entity, certainly in Los Angeles and maybe in other parts of the world as well. Every single one of them passed, usually with a form letter saying doesn't fit into our program. I didn't think there was a script, finally. Once I had finished the novel, I didn't think it was a movie that could be done in, when was that, 1969, 70? And I didn't know how to do it. I was talking to people like Bob Aldrich about the necessity of hiring a midget to play Reagan McNeil. You can't do this, and how are you going to do these effects? And I said, this is not a movie, but, my financial need was great. So, yes, of course I'll write the first draft. Happy to. Figuring the whole thing would get dumped eventually, or they'd hire another writer to come in after me. Warner Brothers at first did not want to hire Bill Friedkin. By contract, we had agreed upon a mutually approved list of 7 directors. I wanted Bill Friedkin in there. They didn't want. He was not mutually approved. But they had, the usual suspects: Stanley Kubrick, Arthur Penn, Mike Nichols, on and on. Well, guess what? All 7 of those men passed. They didn't want to do it. Well, I went back with Bill Friedkin. And then I heard, came to me as a rumor, that they were negotiating with another director. And I called, "Is this true?" I called Frank. And Frank said, "Well, yes, we're negotiating with Mark Rydell. I said, you can't do that. You can't do that. He said, well, Bill, that's what we're doing. And I hung up the phone on him. I called my lawyer and said, can they do this? And my lawyer studied it for a while, called me back in about an hour and said, I'm afraid they can't. So I picked up the phone and called Frank back, and Frank, I said, oh, Bill, I'm so glad you called back. I said, well, I wasn't finished, Frank. I wanted to add that I have checked with my attorneys now, and you're clearly in breach of contract, and I'm not only going to sue you, but I'm due on the Tonight Show on Thursday night, and I'm going to go on and tell them what pirates and thieves and brigands and liars you people are. And I hung up the phone. Warner's believed me. They believed me. They thought I was in the right, and they hadn't even seen Billy's film. They hadn't seen The French Connection. Now they agreed to look at it, and then, of course, they were absolutely gung-ho to hire Billy. Billy was being interviewed by Blake Edwards in the Paramount commissary at a lunch, which I was the only other participant, with a view to hiring Billy for a screenplay I had co-written with Blake. It was Gunn. It was a Peter Gunn script. And Billy pretty much had the job. You know, all he had to do was show up at the lunch and shake hands. Billy said he liked the script, but that there was one scene in it which he thought was not of the texture of the film. And that happened to be a dream sequence which I had written. I made no defense of that, but Blake did. And Billy did not back off. And I started thinking, he's going to blow it. He's not going to get the job. Shut up, Bill. Right? But he didn't. And he didn't get the job. And long after, I thought to myself, when it came time to look for a director, this is a good man to put on this case for a number of reasons. One, he'll give this a sense of documentary reality. And B, I remembered that luncheon, and this is why I remembered the luncheon. The first screenwriting job I ever had was a Danny Kaye comedy, although we didn't know it would be Danny Kaye at the time. It was called The Man from the Diners Club. It was a project that had been shelved, and one day the producer saw me on the Tonight Show, and he thought I was very funny. And he found me and brought me in, and I wrote the script. And they decided to make it. And in came a great comedy director, and I remember him waving that script as he picked up a phone to answer a call in Bill Bloom's office, saying, this is the best comedy script I have ever read. I need a big hit, and that's why I'm doing this. Wonderful. But after he signed the contract, everything changed. It was not such a wonderful script anymore. At any rate, it needed a lot of fixing in the shooting and in the casting. And I remember that I said, you know, I'd like to have a director on this who really tells it straight, who is honest. I believe that with Billy, The Exorcist would not be an excessive film, that because of his powerful, background, the great renown he achieved as a maker of documentaries, he would give it that documentary look. Furthermore, he was not a believer. He would bring an agnostic's sensibility to, what superficially was absolutely wild material. Incredible. No, I knew we'd get a good, I knew we'd get a class act from Bill. Billy would have done all his work, always the night before. He would come into our script meetings. And his methodology was, he showed me the book, he still has it, his copy of the novel. in which each night he would read and he would mark off sections up to that point that he thought should be included in the film. Everything was in the same order exactly as the novel. And he'd come in and tell me, I think we should have this section, we should have that section, we should have that. So, okay, sounds good. And I'd go into my office or stay in my office and do it while he went back to his. And then show it to him, and then he'd study the next section that night. He was methodical, and he didn't have a lot of patience with too much dialogue, as I recall. But the most salient recollection is that he had a very orderly approach to the material. He did say your first draft is not faithful to the novel. Actually, it was. But in its opening pages, it seemed not to be. In the novel, there is a patient, gradual onset of developments, especially with respect to the girl's illness and the onset of full-blown possession. Faced with, again, what I thought was an impossible task of condensing the novel into a 2-hour movie, I thought, what can I do? And so I compressed the onset to 30 pages in which a lot of cinematic tricks were played, in that there were many superimposures, freezing of the frame, going back and forth in time, doing all that to give you a compressed and 33 pages thing. And of course, Billy looked at it and all he saw was tricks. This is flashy. This is, there's nothing flashy about the development of The Exorcist. So to that extent, he was absolutely correct with respect to the opening section. Those quotes, especially dealing with Auschwitz, so on, were in that first draft that Billy said was not faithful to the novel. And yes, I was sorry to lose them, and I was also outraged when I picked up a German edition one day and saw that they had been dropped from that edition. Nobody had ever run that past me. I guess an unbelievable sensitivity to, and I don't know, face the facts, Germany. When I wrote the novel, I had laid in a number of striking instances of the horrifying evil in the world, unprovoked, unmotivated evil. I'm talking about moral evil. I remembered a quote from an FBI wiretap of some Cosa Nostra figures who had taken a guy named Jackson, a very huge, he weighed about 330 pounds, 50 pounds, and they had hung him up on a meat hook and were prodding him with electric prods while they threw water over him and giggling about it. And there were references, the three closing references of this type of evil were one-word descriptions, not descriptions. They were Dachau, Buchenwald, Auschwitz, just those three words, that of the ultimate evocation of evil. And they were in my first draft of the screenplay. They were among the superimposures that I used. As I recall, I had an interior scene in a Catholic church, late at night, charwoman's mopping the floor, and I used the Stations of the Cross for those superimposures underneath each tableau. And then we heard a series of tapping, erratic, but somehow with an intelligence behind them, muffled tapping, rapping sounds. We followed them out into the street, down the street, and finally into the McNeil house. That's how the film originally opened in my first draft, as I recall. The cut we're looking at now is officially Billy's cut, the director's cut. It is not the cut that I first was shown by Billy in New York in a moviola, which was approximately 16 to 18 maybe minutes longer, which I thought was, see, today The Exorcist is deemed by some to be a classic. That's because it withstood the test of a little time, 25 years or so. But it is not in my mind a masterpiece. But the film that I saw in the moviola that day was a masterpiece. And I wish that were the form in which it had been released. I still wish it could be re-released in that format. Well, first, carpentry is missing, although no one in the audience seems to notice it. It is astounding to me. You have an early portion of the film in which suddenly we're at a party, not suddenly, but we're at a party at Chris MacNeil's home, and we see Regan MacNeil smiling and giggling in a little silent shot. And in a few minutes or less, she's urinating on the rug, telling an astronaut he's going to die in space. And then she asks her mother, "What's wrong with me?" as Chris is bathing her. And Chris says, "Honey, it's just like the doctor said." Doctor? What doctor? Keep taking those pills. What pills? I didn't know the little girl had a problem. True, as Billy has pointed out to me, there is the scene in which Chris MacNeil is angrily trying to reach the girl's father because it's her birthday and he didn't call, and the little girl hears her saying, well, he just doesn't care about her. And she obviously looks subdued and suppressed. But there was a greater onset. There was originally a scene in which Chris takes Regan out sightseeing, Lincoln Memorial and so on, and they end up at the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, with a scene in which abruptly the little girl says, "Mommy, why do people have to die?" And Billy loves that scene, to this day. There's the beginning. There's a problem there. And then there was a scene, an extended scene with the doctor. And a very shocking scene, as a matter of fact. But once again, it's the onset. Now we find out the girl is using absolutely vile, foul language. And so that was the carpentry. But what I miss, most of all, was a brief scene. Actually, it's a couple of lines of dialogue that were taken out of a scene that exists today. Between sessions of the ritual of exorcism, when Karras and Merrin, exhausted, are resting on the steps, Karras, in the excised material, says words to the effect of, "Fine, I don't need a building to fall on me. She's possessed. What's the point? If she's possessed, what is the point? What is the Prince of Darkness doing inhabiting the body of a 12-year-old girl?" And Merrin explains it to him. And as we discussed before, I think that she is not the target. It's everyone in the house. And the idea is to make us all feel vile and animal and putrescent, so that if there were a God, he couldn't possibly love us. And of course, that carries the moral core of the film and of the novel. It would have carried it in the film. And there was a very practical side effect, I believe, would have occurred had that line been retained. It ended simply that the audience who loved the film would be allowed not to despise themselves for loving all this shock and obscenity and vulgarity. They would say, now I understand why the filmmaker and the author did all that. It's to make this point. That's why. So I miss that very sorely. And of course, what I miss most of all is the original ending of the novel, which Billy shot with Lee Cobb and Father O'Malley, who played Father Dyer. the Casablanca ending. This looks like the beginning of a beautiful friendship. It gave you a sense that everything was going to be all right. In fact, not going to be. Everything really was all right. So that even if you were too numb to notice that Karras had taken the demon out the window, this would tell your unconscious that everything was okay. It was just the right note. And curiously, when we had that wonderful screening recently at Mann's Chinese, when we came out, first thing Billy said to me out in the lobby was, you know, I see it now. That original ending really should have been in there. He said, you know, at that point, the film needs to be able to breathe. It needs some breathing room. And maybe it will go back in one day. I was living in Georgetown after the film came out in the late 70s. And I lived across the street from the campus. And in fact, 3 doors down from the infamous Hitchcock steps, now called the Exorcist steps. And I wandered over to the library, and I was back. I don't know what I was doing. I might have been researching something or whatever. But I went in and I pulled all the cards on possession, exorcism there. There weren't many. All of a sudden, I had in my hands a summary by a Jesuit priest who had been at the university of that case with the name of the victim. I couldn't believe it. I defaced it. I took a marker pen and I blacked out the name. But if it was there, it had to be in so many other places. And when the exorcist, Father Bowden, would plead with me, please, I mean, we corresponded for many years until his death. He never failed to make mention of, please don't ever say anything that would connect this boy. It would cause such incredible trauma to him, psychological stress. Don't do it. But there it was. And if you went down to the Chancery office of the Archdiocese in Washington, D.C., which I never did, Billy did, Friedkin, he went down and he found the diary. He read the whole diary, which has everything in it, everything. He was under the auspices of one of our technical advisors, Father John J. Nicola, that he got into the Chancery office. And there he was reading it. I couldn't believe it. Then, you know, I never read the diary kept by the exorcists until after the novel had been published, when I received in the mail one day a large brown manila envelope with some documents in it and a little note from someone, a priest or a brother at the Alexian Brothers Hospital in St. Louis, Missouri, who said, you know, Mr. Blatty, I read your book, very interesting. I thought you would be interested in this. These are some papers that were found in the nightstand of one of the brothers who died here some years ago. It was the diary. It was Father Bowden's diary, which, you know, was written every day, and every person in the room other than the victim who was witness to the events was required to sign off on it, to read it and sign it. Yes, this happened. This is what occurred, which is why it's so compelling.